Con la primera sesión plenaria sobre Key Issues of the Global Energy Agenda, para que tenemos el honor de contar con el secretario general del International Energy Forum, Joseph McMonigle. Mr. McMonigle se encuentra aquí en persona en el auditorio con nosotros. Good morning, Mr. McMonigle. It has been a very nice surprise finding last week that you could be here with us in person. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and doing the effort of coming from Riyadh. It's a real privilege to have you here to give us a general overview of the key issues of the global energy agenda. Your view is going to be particularly interesting in this time of turbulent markets. For those who doesn't know, the International Energy Forum, let me explain, was founded 30 years ago, is today the world's largest organization of energy ministers from 72 countries and includes both producing and consuming nations. IEF has a broad mandate to examine all energy issues, including oil and gas, clean and renewable, energy sustainability, energy transitions, and new technologies. It has also an important role providing data transparency and a strong focus on the critical issues of energy poverty. Joseph McMonigle officially assumed his position July 1st, 2020, as the 5th Secretary General. He has over 20 years of experience working on energy issues on the public and private sectors. I'm not going to mention all the details of his CV, just mention a few things. Mr. McMonigle was Chief of Staff of the U.S. Department of Energy during the first term of the Bush administration, 2001-2005. He also served 2 years as former Vice Chairman and U.S. Representative of the International Energy Agency. And in addition, he was the U.S. co-chair of the U.S.-China Energy Working Group as part of the DOA portfolio. Once again, it's a pleasure having you with us. Secretary General McMonigle, please, when you can.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a really great pleasure to join in person, even though we have a hybrid event. It's great to have many of us meeting in person. Really, it's one of the first in-person speeches I've given since taking the job, so it's a real pleasure to do this. And I want to thank the Spanish Committee of the World Energy Council and the Energy Club of Spain, as well as the Elcano Institute and CEPSA. I'm pleased to have so many friends also with us today. I'm especially honored that Minister Ana Palacio is here, someone that I've worked with back in my time in government, and really a pleasure, and look forward to your session as well. And also to my friend and collaborator and advisor to the IEF, Yvonne Martens. Thank you for being here and all your help over the years. The chairman gave you a little bit of background on the IEF, but just to put it in a capsule before I start the speech, just to give you a little perspective of where we come from. The IEF was founded about 30 years ago, so this year is actually our 30th anniversary. It was founded really as a way for producers and consumers, mainly OPEC and IEA, to begin discussing issues and collaborating, because prior to that time, really both groups were in their separate camps and really did not talk that much. So we are the producer-consumer of the groups. Both IEA and OPEC are non-voting members of my executive board. But increasingly, especially as we talk about these issues today, our group is also, in addition to being producer-consumer organization, we're also the organization of developed and developing countries. And I think this is a critical role for us in the upcoming debates. So I appreciate the opportunity to provide some remarks on the global energy agenda and give you a perspective on achieving increasingly urgent energy, climate, and sustainable development goals from the International Energy Forum, the IEF. As we meet this week, the interconnectivity of these goals are on full display. Gas markets in Europe and now Asia are on red alert. Natural gas is now the most expensive fossil fuel on an energy equivalent basis, comparable to an oil price of about $200 per barrel. It's critical that we don't let a climate crisis turn into an energy crisis. We need to keep making progress on climate action, certainly, while at the same time ensure that we have energy supplies today to power the global economy. And I'm particularly concerned about high energy prices and volatility and what that might do to undermine public support for climate action. Because once we lose public support, it's very difficult to build back. As a result, the IEF is announcing today that we will hold a special natural gas market dialogue meeting with both producer and consumer ministers on October 28th, along with industry experts, many CEOs of energy companies, both gas companies and power companies. So let me just go into a little bit of how we see the current state of the global energy sector, and especially with regards to the pandemic. Certainly the rebound in fossil fuel demand after the pandemic was really anticipated. As the world awakens after COVID, economic growth has returned. The OECD September report showed that global GDP is already above 2019 levels. The OECD global growth forecast for 2021 is 5.7%. In 2022, it's forecast to be 4.5%, and that's compared to a decline of 3.4% in 2020. In addition, something that we're all familiar with, the ongoing tightness in supply chains is also causing tension in the global energy market. And it also must be noted that government stimulus plans and programs support demand in infrastructure and construction and also generate more demand. The transportation sector was probably the hardest hit. Aviation is still about 25% below pre-COVID levels. It was offset, however, by increased demand in other sectors, for example, petrochemicals, industrial and power generation. And of course, we've had fuel switching mainly in Asia. As far as oil is concerned, really all previous oil demand shocks have shown strong and immediate rebounds, and this is certainly the case this time. So will 2021 be a record in fossil fuel demand? Well, it will be close. On a quarterly basis, the fourth quarter of 2021 will certainly be higher than 2019. Also, we had a warmer winter last year. In particular, Europe had a mild winter in 2019-2020. It was the warmest on record. And Asia had a mild start to the winter last year. So if this is just a normal or even colder than normal winter, energy demand will certainly be higher in the fourth quarter versus 2019. And unfortunately, this is very ominous for gas markets and the power sector. Last week, the IEA came out with their World Energy Outlook report, and it had two main takeaways, at least from our view. Number one, the world is not investing enough in clean energy to meet our climate goals. And number two, the world is not investing enough in oil and gas to keep up with our demand for fossil fuels. And the IEF agrees on both of these points. We must continue with the deployment of more renewables to meet our climate goals. But on the second point, I'd like to sort of talk a little bit more and give you a perspective from the IEF viewpoint regarding investment in oil and gas supplies. Last year, the IEF rang the alarm bell with a report that we issued along with Boston Consulting Group, Yvonne's former place of business. And we called it a peak investment crisis in oil and gas development. And essentially what we did was outlined CapEx cuts by companies of 35% in 2020. We're currently working on updating the report for a December release, and we're seeing another decline in CapEx investment this year of about 25%. We said at the time, 2 years in a row of significant CapEx cuts will result in volatility and higher prices, and it has arrived even sooner than anticipated. The report stated that industry investment will have to rise over the next 3 years by 25% yearly from 2020 levels just to stave off a crisis. So I also agree with others that say that there are many factors for the current gas crisis in Europe and that we can't blame it solely on the energy transition. Certainly COVID is a big reason, as I've explained, but as I've explained, there are structural and fundamental issues about energy markets and systems impacted by investment that are really at the heart of the problem. I'm very concerned about the upcoming winter months, but it's important to note that when winter is ended in April or May, whenever it will be, these structural issues will remain. Now, market uncertainty about COVID and the transition pathways present major challenges for policymakers and companies with regard to these investment decisions. The IEF every year in February hosts the annual Energy Outlook Symposium, and this is where we have OPEC and IEA come, along with many private sector companies, present their outlooks for energy for the upcoming year. And just to take a snapshot of these outlook scenarios, over the next 20 years, the difference between the high and low demand cases is about 55 million barrels a day, whereas 10 years ago, it was only about 30 million barrels a day. Just to put this in context, 55 million barrels a day is more than half of today's oil market. If you're an energy company, how do you run your strategy and plan your investments? And it's particularly hard for policymakers as well, as we're seeing played out. The world has clear goals, but it lacks clear policies and certainty. Finally, the other area of great need of investment, in our view, is clean energy R&D. The IEA technology report, which came out last year, is probably one of the best IEA products that has come out in a while. And that report said that half of the emissions reduction needed to meet climate goals must come from innovation and new technologies. As a US citizen and the first Secretary General who is an American, I was pleased to see and have commended the Biden administration for proposing a 4-fold increase in clean energy R&D to get to $30 billion by 2030. In addition, President Macron last week introduced a new modern industrial strategy for France to invest in green hydrogen and small modular nuclear reactors with an investment of $30 billion by 2030. I know Spain has made big announcements about green hydrogen, as has Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both of which hope to become major exporters of this clean energy. While the private sector is doing its part on R&D, we really need governments to step up and take primary responsibility for clean energy R&D. It's critical to meeting our climate goals. The IEF is encouraging all governments to take the lead in this regard, and we are currently working on a tracker of clean energy R&D by governments to monitor progress. So let me end by thanking the World Energy Council of Spain and the Spanish Energy Club for having me here. It's so good to be here in person and meeting colleagues involved in discussion about energy policy and markets. Now more than ever, we need dialogue about energy security, market stability, and the transition. And with that, I'll be happy to take your questions.
McMonigle. Just two very quick questions. The first is about what about innovation and new technologies? With your feeling about your knowledge around the world, which do you think would be the most relevant technologies to be focused now? And a small comment about nuclear, please.
Okay. Certainly. Well, obviously, one of them I mentioned in my remarks, and that's hydrogen, and green hydrogen in particular. And here I think really we have to commend the EU and countries in Europe for taking the leadership in promoting hydrogen in terms of investment and policies and a roadmap. And indeed, it's given hydrogen, I think, great momentum around the world. And so I think really that is a credit to the EU, because I don't think it would have happened but for the emphasis that the EU and Europe is placing on hydrogen. The other one I would say is CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Even for hydrogen, which we just talked about, you need economy-wide uptake of CCUS and an implementation of CCUS. And really it's an area, even though I know it's controversial to some in some sectors, it's an area where both climate and energy ministers both agree. And I think it's critical to meeting our climate goals, it's critical for energy security, it's critical for affordability, which is one of the main issues today. So I think both of those sectors, I think, are, those are really the favorite technologies, but you know, there could be others, and one of them you mentioned in the question is nuclear. And I do think nuclear, we're starting to see a little bit of a resurgence now back again as countries now look at their climate goals and realize they need new technologies in order to meet these goals that the countries are setting. And certainly, I mentioned the industrial policy that President Macron announced. Nuclear is one of the key components to it. Small modular nuclear reactors, not the big, you know, major nuclear complexes that we have today. But and you know, France of course has a great record and nuclear sector, and I think it's very significant that they're placing nuclear as a key component. I'd also note that the UK this week I think is announcing their strategy ahead of the COP meeting. Maybe we'll hear more of it today in one of the future panels, but at least according to press reports, nuclear looks to be a very big component of that UK strategy. So I think in both respects that's very favorable. I think also you probably will be hearing more from other European countries and the US on nuclear as well.
Just to finalize very briefly, you mentioned that we're a bit behind in investment in renewables. We haven't made enough investment to maintain the level of fossil fuels. This means that this price is back. What impact do you think it will have in the meeting of the COP26 now in Glasgow, and what do you think that would be the best outcome for the meeting? Just very briefly, please.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, there's no escaping that higher prices and volatility will be a backdrop for this COP meeting. I don't think it was originally back in the summer when organizers were planning the event that this would be the situation we would find ourselves in. But I think it's important because one of the other things I talked about in my remarks was volatility and higher prices undermining public support for climate action. And once you lose that, it's very hard to get back. And so what I'm hoping is that even though it'll be a big challenge and maybe even a distraction of sorts, I'm hoping that policymakers and delegates attending the COP meeting will engage more in a dialogue on the transition and maybe move away from what is viewed by many as a monologue right now. And so I think it's good that we're reminded that the markets are sending us a signal, and the delegates to COP, I think, have to be careful about that, because at the end of the day, we need to solve the climate crisis and we need public support to do it. In terms of what I think might be a successful outcome of COP, I would say two things. One is on the topic of methane. The US and the EU have announced this global methane challenge program to get countries to sign up for reductions by 2030. Methane, of course, is a primary cause of global warming, second only to CO2. And it traps 82 times the amount of emissions that CO2 does. So any kind of action on methane can have really tangible and important progress for climate change if we mitigate those emissions. And we know how to do it. It's cost effective. And I would just say that the IEF, from our standpoint, back in June of this year, we launched our own methane initiative, which basically tried to develop, along with a handful, a committee of member countries, a methodology for methane mitigation. And essentially, we teamed up with a French company, Kairos, who's a geospatial data firm, using EU satellite data, but also AI and big data, and also some, of course, expert analysis, and came up with timelines and defined methodologies in a transparent way. And so our initiative kind of complements what the EU and the US are doing on the global methane challenge. Now we have a methodology which we really didn't have. It's a very, methane emissions reduction is quite complicated, but we think we've played a role in sort of improving the way to go about that. And so now we have the methodology, we need to use it, we need to make it real. And so I see methane as being a key outcome potentially, and a big success point. Of course, the IPCC report this summer highlighted methane reduction as a key and important matter for the world to address. And the other one, I would just say, keep an eye on this. We mentioned it in the first question regarding nuclear. With France announcing nuclear being a new component, the UK, I think, announcing this week or shortly that nuclear will be a big component of their transition agenda. I'm a little privy to other activities that will be planned at COP. I know at least one or two other countries that will be making major announcements regarding nuclear. So I think you could see nuclear really emerge as a key solution, because I think it's now that we're looking at the problem, we have to get real about the solutions. And nuclear is certainly a real solution, one that we have now. Certainly there are technology improvements that can be made, but I think you could see nuclear as another key successful outcome of COP, and I think that would be a terrific thing.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. McMonigle. It has been a pleasure having you for such an interesting speech, so thank you.
Yes.